The Arizona sun hung like a brass button in the cloudless sky, baking the red earth until it cracked like old leather. Mabel Quinn paused in her mending to wipe the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, careful not to prick herself with the needle. Through the open door of their modest dwelling behind the blacksmith shop, she could hear her father's labored breathing as he tried to work the bellows despite his weakening condition. "Rest yourself, Pa," she called out, setting aside the torn shirt she'd been patching. "I'll tend the forge." Seamus Quinn, once the strongest man in Dry Creek, now leaned heavily against his anvil. His face, weathered by 20 years under the territorial sun, had taken on a grayish pallor these past weeks. "No daughter of mine should be doing smithy work," he wheezed, though his protest lacked conviction. Mabel had heard this argument before. She tied back her auburn hair with a strip of calico and rolled up her sleeves. "And no father of mine should be working himself to death over debts that weren't rightly his to begin with." The debts. Always the debts. 3 months ago, Seamus had purchased what he thought was quality coal from Horace Bell's freight company, only to discover too late that it was mostly slate and low-grade anthracite that barely held heat. The ruined horseshoes and bent nails had cost him his reputation and most of his customers. Bell's bank had been quick to call in the loan, adding interest that grew like desert weeds after rain. As Mabel pumped the bellows, bringing the forge back to life, she caught sight of Reverend Silas Pike crossing the dusty Main Street. The man's black coat seemed to absorb the sunlight, and his pale eyes had a way of making folks feel like sinners even when they'd done nothing wrong. He'd been particularly attentive since their troubles began, stopping by with offers of Christian charity that always came with strings attached like spider silk. The Quinn girl's out there doing man's work again," she heard someone mutter from the street. Mrs. Harlan, probably, who ran the general store with her husband and had opinions about everything. "Mark my words, that family brings ill fortune," came the reply. "First the mother passes, now the father ailing, and that girl with her book learning and stubborn ways. No good comes from a woman who won't know her place." Mabel's jaw tightened, but she kept pumping the bellows steady. She'd heard worse, in a town like Dry Creek, where the railroad fever had everyone dreaming of fortune while most barely scraped by. People needed someone to blame for their disappointments. The educated daughter of an Irish blacksmith made an easy target. The sound of hooves on the wooden bridge drew her attention. A group of riders approached from the direction of Crown Sea Ranch, dust devils dancing in their wake. She recognized the lead rider by his posture alone. Eli Calder sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, which he practically had. They called him the Cowboy King in town, though whether in respect or mockery depended on who was talking. Calder had built Crown Sea from nothing, starting with a handful of maverick cattle and sheer determination. Now he ran one of the few successful operations in the territory, though Mabel had heard whispers that even he was feeling the squeeze from the banks and the drought. As the riders passed, Calder touched the brim of his hat in her direction. It was a small gesture, but more courtesy than most showed her these days. Mabel nodded back, then returned to her work. She had no time for wool gathering about tall cowboys with eyes the color of winter sage. The forge was good and hot now, and she set about finishing the batch of nails her father had started. The rhythm of hammer on anvil helped quiet her churning thoughts. Strike, turn, strike, turn. Each nail perfectly formed, perfectly serviceable. If only life's problems could be shaped so easily. "Miss Quinn," she started, nearly dropping her hammer. Reverend Pike stood in the doorway, his shadow falling across the packed dirt floor like a stain. Reverend." She kept her voice neutral, continuing her work. "If you're here about Sunday service, I'm afraid Pa's not well enough. I'm here about your father's soul, Miss Quinn, and yours." Pike stepped inside without invitation, his boots clicking on the hard ground. "The Lord helps those who help themselves, but he also expects his flock to accept guidance when offered. We're managing fine, thank you. Are you? Pike's thin lips curved in what might have been a smile on a warmer face. Your father owes $300 to Bell's bank. The interest compounds daily. In 3 days' time, they'll have the legal right to seize this property and everything on it. Mabel's hammer paused mid-strike. $300 might as well have been $3,000. The coal was bad. Pa's work suffered through no fault of his own. The courts care nothing for excuses, child. But there are arrangements that could be made. Christian solutions to earthly problems. Something in his tone made her skin crawl like ants had found their way under her collar. What kind of arrangements? Pike moved closer, and she smelled hair pomade and something sour underneath. A young woman of your circumstances might find security in marriage. I know several upstanding men who would overlook your family's difficulties for the right incentive. I'm not for sale. Reverend, pride goeth before a fall. Miss Quinn, would you rather see your father thrown into the street, watch him die in shame? His voice dropped to a whisper. I'm trying to save you both, but salvation requires sacrifice. The hammer felt heavy in her hand. For a wild moment, she imagined bringing it down on Pike's polished boots. Instead, she set it carefully on the anvil. I'll discuss it with my father. You do that. Pike adjusted his coat. Remember, 3 days. After that, even the Lord's mercy has limits. After he left, Mabel stood in the dying light of the forge, watching the coals fade from orange to red to gray. Through the wall, she could hear her father coughing, each ragged breath a reminder of how much she stood to lose. She walked to the water barrel and splashed her face, washing away the soot and sweat but not the feeling of being trapped. In the small cracked mirror propped against the wall, she saw what others saw, a young woman past the usual marrying age, too educated for her station, too poor for better prospects, too proud to beg. But she also saw her mother's stubborn chin and her father's steady eyes. Whatever came in 3 days, she wouldn't let them take her dignity along with everything else. That night, she sat by her father's bed, spooning thin broth between his lips while he protested weakly that he wasn't a baby. The lamplight made shadows dance on the walls, and outside, a coyote howled at the rising moon. I heard Pike was here, Seamus said between sips. Just checking on us. She kept her voice light. You know how he is. Her father's hand, still strong despite his illness, caught hers. Mabel, girl, whatever that vulture offered, whatever he threatened, don't you dare trade yourself for my mistakes. Pa. I mean it. Your mother would rise from her grave and box my ears if I let you. If I let anyone. He fell back against the pillow, spent from the effort. Mabel squeezed his hand. Rest now. We'll figure something out. But as she sat in the darkness, listening to his labored breathing and the distant sound of laughter from the saloon, she couldn't see how. The walls of their small home seemed to press closer with each passing hour. 3 days, 72 hours before everything they'd built crumbled like dried mud in the sun. She lit a candle and pulled out her mother's Bible. Not for prayer, but for the pressed flower hidden in Psalms, a desert marigold. Still holding a ghost of yellow after all these years. Her mother had picked it the day they'd arrived in Arizona territory, full of hope for new beginnings. Nothing blooms without water, she'd said, but some things are strong enough to wait for rain. Mabel pressed the flower gently between her fingers. Tomorrow she'd have to be practical, maybe even desperate, but tonight she'd allow herself to remember that somewhere beyond the drought and dust and debt, rain still fell on luckier ground. The candle burned low as she finally dozed in her chair, her father's hand in hers, while outside the night wind rattled the loose board on the shed and carried the faint sound of cattle lowing from the distant ranches. In 3 days, the hammer would fall. The question was whether anything would be left standing when the dust settled. The morning of the 3rd day dawned clear and merciless. Mabel stood before the cracked mirror, pinning her mother's cameo to her best dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. Her hands were steady, though her heart beat like a trapped bird against her ribs. "You don't have to do this," Seamus said from his bed, though they both knew it was a lie. The fever had broken in the night, leaving him weak but clear-eyed enough to understand what his daughter was about to sacrifice. "I'm just going to hear what they have to say," Mabel replied, though the contract she'd signed with trembling hands the night before said otherwise. The labor bond Reverend Pike had presented was dressed up in legal language, but she knew what it meant. 1 year of service to whoever paid her father's debts, with marriage as the expected outcome. It was slavery wrapped in silk words, but it was the only option that kept a roof over her father's head. The auction platform had been hastily erected outside the town hall, where usually they sold livestock and surplus goods. Today, they would sell something else entirely. Pike had assured her it would be done with dignity, but Mabel knew better. There was no dignity in desperation. She arrived to find a crowd already gathering, faces she knew twisted with curiosity and judgment. "Mrs." Harlan whispered behind her fan to the banker's wife. Jeb Crow, Pike's shadow of a man, stood near the platform with his arms crossed, wearing that leather vest he never took off despite the heat. His presence alone was enough to keep anyone from causing trouble. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pike's voice rang out across the square. "We gathered today in Christian charity to help one of our own. Miss Mabel Quinn has volunteered to enter into a labor contract to satisfy her family's debts. This is a legal and binding arrangement, sanctioned by territorial law." Mabel climbed the steps on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The sun beat down on her shoulders, and she could smell dust and horse sweat and the sickly sweet pomade Pike used to slick his hair. "The terms are simple," Pike continued. 1 year of service, with the expectation of marriage should both parties agree. The winner of this auction will pay $300 directly to Bell's bank and receive Miss Quinn's contracted services. "Services," someone snorted from the crowd. "That what they're calling it now?" Pike's eyes flashed. "Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will answer to the law." Jeb Crow shifted, his hand moving to rest on his sidearm. The bidding started low, $50 from a traveling merchant with yellow teeth and wandering eyes. Then $75 from a rancher old enough to be her grandfather. Each bid felt like another stone added to the weight on her chest. $100, called a voice that made her skin crawl. Chester Briggs, who ran the freight office and was known for working his employees into the ground. $150, this from a man she didn't recognize. Probably come in with the railroad crews. He had the look of someone who collected things, and the way he studied her made her feel like a horse at market. The auctioneer, a weasel-faced man from Bell's bank, raised his gavel. $150 going once. $300. The crowd parted like water before a ship's prow. Eli Calder strode through, his spurs ringing against the wooden platform as he climbed the steps. He hadn't dressed for town. Dust still clung to his work clothes, and his hat showed the salt lines of honest sweat. "Mr. Calder," Pike's voice was carefully neutral. "This is a serious proceeding. I said $300. Eli pulled a leather pouch from his coat and tossed it to the auctioneer. "Cash money. Count it if you like." The weasel-faced man's fingers flew over the coins and bills. It's all here." "Then we're done." Eli turned to Mabel, and for the first time since she'd climbed those steps, she met someone's eyes without seeing judgment or hunger. His expression was unreadable as wide-open sky. "Mr. Calder," Pike interceded. "You understand the terms. This is a binding contract for marriage." "I can read, Reverend." Eli's voice carried the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. "The lady and I will work out the details ourselves." Pike's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The crowd buzzed with speculation. The Cowboy King, who'd never shown interest in any woman, had just paid a fortune for a blacksmith's daughter. "Sold," the auctioneer's voice cracked as he brought down his gavel. "For gold to pay her father's debt." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Mabel felt them sink into her bones, marking her, sold for gold, like a horse or a plow or a piece of land. "Can you ride?" Eli asked quietly, standing close enough that she could smell leather and tobacco and something clean like sage. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. Get your things. We'll be married within the hour and then head to Crown Sea, unless—" He paused, studying her face. "Unless you'd rather I left you here and just forgot about the money." The offer stunned her. $300, tossed away like nothing. She looked out at the crowd, at Pike's furious face, at Jeb Crow's suspicious glare. Then she thought of her father, safe in his bed, keeping his home and his forge. "I honor my contracts, Mr. Calder." Something flickered in his gray-green eyes. Respect, maybe, or disappointment. "Fair enough. 1 hour, Miss Quinn." The ceremony at the Justice of the Peace's office was brief and businesslike. Eli had brought 2 of his ranch hands as witnesses, an older man named Walter with kind eyes and a young Mexican vaquero who introduced himself as Luis. Mabel signed her name with a steady hand, watching it transform from Quinn to Calder in a few strokes of ink. "You may kiss your bride," the justice said, already reaching for his next set of papers. Eli looked at her, a question in his eyes. She gave the slightest nod, and he leaned down to brush his lips against her cheek, so quickly she barely felt it. "That'll do," he said, and she wasn't sure if he was talking to the justice or himself. The ride to Crown Sea took 3 hours through country that grew rougher with each mile. Mabel sat straight in the saddle of the mare Eli had brought for her, a gentle bay with a white star on her forehead. Her few possessions, clothes, her mother's Bible, her father's tools that she'd insisted on bringing, were packed in saddlebags. They stopped once to water the horses at a spring hidden in a cluster of cottonwoods. Eli handed her a canteen without speaking, and she drank gratefully, the water sweet and cold. "Why?" she asked finally, the question that had been burning since the auction. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Pike and Bell have been circling my land like buzzards for months. The drought's been hard, and I've got loans coming due. According to territorial law, a married man's homestead can't be seized for debt for the first year. Gives me time to get the ranch back on solid ground. So I'm insurance, if that's what you want to call it." He looked at her directly. "I needed a wife on paper. You needed out of that auction. Seems like we both got something we needed." It was practical, cold, even, but also honest, which was more than most had offered her. "What about expectations?" The words felt like hot coals in her mouth. "You'll have your own room. The old summer kitchen's been closed up for years, but it's got good walls and a stove. We'll tell people what they need to hear, but what happens at Crown Sea is our business." He paused. "I'm not the kind of man who takes what isn't freely given, Mrs. Calder. That's not negotiable." The relief was so strong her hands shook. She gripped the reins tighter to hide it. "And my duties? Can you cook?" "Yes." "Then cook. The boys have been living on burned beans and jerky so long they've probably forgotten what real food tastes like. Beyond that," he shrugged. "Ranch life's hard. Everyone pulls their weight, but you'll not be treated as anything less than mistress of Crown Sea. Anyone who says otherwise answers to me." They reached the ranch as the sun was starting its descent. Crown Sea spread before them, not grand, but solid. The main house was adobe and timber, built to last. Barns and corrals were well maintained, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, but there were signs of struggle too. A windmill with broken blades, a well with a new rope that suggested the old one had snapped, fence posts that needed repair. The ranch hands gathered as they rode in, curiosity plain on their faces. Besides Walter and Luis, she counted 4 others, a large man with coal-black skin introduced as Josiah, a pair of brothers who looked barely old enough to shave, and a grizzled older hand everyone called Tex. "Boys," Eli announced without preamble. "This is Mrs. Calder. She'll be running the house from now on. You'll treat her with respect, or you'll be looking for new employment." Questions. There were none, though Mabel caught the meaningful looks exchanged. The summer kitchen was exactly as promised, dusty from disuse but structurally sound, with a good stove and a bed with a corn husk mattress. It connected to the main house through a covered walkway, giving her privacy while maintaining proprieties. "It's not much," Eli said from the doorway, not entering her space. "It's perfect." And it was. Her own walls, her own door, her own choice to open it or keep it closed. He nodded and turned to go, then paused. "Supper's usually at sundown, but take tonight to settle in. The boys can survive one more night of burned beans." After he left, Mabel sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the weight of the day. Sold for gold, married to a stranger, living on a ranch miles from town with men she didn't know, but also safe, her father's debts paid, a roof over her head that no bank could take, and a husband who seemed to want no more from her than hot meals and the legal benefits of marriage. She unpacked slowly, placing her mother's Bible on the small shelf, hanging her few dresses on the pegs by the door. As the sun set, painting the adobe walls rose and gold, she heard laughter from the bunkhouse, the lowing of cattle, the creak of the broken windmill trying to catch the evening breeze. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but then, nothing about Dry Creek was what anyone imagined when they'd come seeking fortune in the territory. You made do with what the desert gave you, and if you were lucky, if you were strong, you might coax something to bloom. She lit the lamp as darkness fell, and through her window, she could see lights in the main house, her husband's house, the stranger she'd married for convenience and necessity, who'd paid gold for her freedom even while purchasing her service. Tomorrow, she'd cook breakfast for 7 hungry men. She'd start learning the rhythms of ranch life. She'd begin the year of obligation that would free them both. But tonight, in her own room with her own door, Mabel Quinn Calder pulled out her needle and thread and began mending a torn shirt by lamplight, each stitch small and precise, building something useful from what was broken. It was, she thought, as good a way as any to begin. The smell of biscuits and fresh coffee drew the ranch hands to the main house like iron filings to a magnet. Mabel had risen before dawn, finding her way around the dusty kitchen by lamplight, discovering neglected treasures, a good cast-iron skillet, sacks of flour and beans, even preserved peaches forgotten in the back of a cupboard. "Lord have mercy," Walter breathed, staring at the spread on the table. "Are those eggs?" "Found a few hens scratching around out back," Mabel said, setting down another platter. "They seemed happy enough to trade eggs for feed." The men fell on the food like they hadn't seen a proper meal in months, which, from the state of the kitchen, they probably hadn't. Only Eli held back, sipping his coffee and watching her over the rim of his cup. "This is fine cooking, ma'am," young Tom, one of the brothers, said through a mouthful of biscuit. "Don't talk with your mouth full." His brother Sam elbowed him. "Boys," Eli's quiet words settled them. "Mrs. Calder, might I have a word?" She followed him onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. The morning was still cool, the sun just painting the eastern hills pink and gold. "The hands eat in the bunkhouse," he said, not unkindly. "It's how things are done." "On cold biscuits and yesterday's coffee," she met his gaze steadily. "A man works better on a full stomach. Mr. Calder, your choice, of course, but seems to me you're running a ranch, not a prison." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise. Maybe at being challenged in his own house. Then the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. Fair point, but you shouldn't be waiting on them like a servant, she raised an eyebrow. Isn't that what I am? Or would you prefer I sit idle while grown men burn beans? This time he did smile, just barely. Do what you think best, Mrs. Calder. Just remember you're the lady of the house, not the hired help. I'll remember, she said, though privately she thought there wasn't much difference between the two in her current situation. The days fell into a rhythm. Up before dawn to start breakfast, then laundry or mending while the men worked. Afternoon she'd taken to teaching letters to Luis, who was eager to improve his English, and even Josiah had shyly asked if she might help him with his figures. Never had much schooling, the big man admitted. But I'd like to know enough to not get cheated when I sell my leather goods in town. It was during one of these lessons that trouble first appeared. They were gathered around the kitchen table, Luis practicing his letters, Josiah working sums, even young Tom listening in when hooves thundered into the yard. Eli appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Inside work's done for today, boys. They scattered immediately, recognizing the tone through the window. Mabel saw riders, 5 of them, led by a man in a city suit despite the dust and heat. Railroad men, Eli said quietly. Stay inside. But Mabel had never been good at following orders that didn't make sense. She stepped onto the porch, staying in the shadows but close enough to hear. Mr. Calder, the suited man was saying. I'm Frederick Hammond from the Central Railroad Company. I believe you received our latest offer. I did. Eli stood relaxed, but Mabel noticed how his hand stayed within reach of his sidearm. Answer's still no. That's unfortunate. We're prepared to be generous, very generous, for access to your water rights at Willow Creek. That creek's the only thing keeping my cattle alive in dry years. No sale. Hammond's smile was cold as a snake's. Everything's for sale at the right price. And between us, Mr. Calder, you might find it difficult to refuse. Banks can be fickle about loans, especially when influential parties express concerns about a borrower's stability. That a threat, merely an observation. I heard you recently married, quite suddenly, in fact, to a woman of questionable background. His eyes found Mabel in the shadows. How fortunate that territorial law protects married homesteaders. For now. Eli took a step forward, and his men, who'd appeared as if from nowhere, shifted positions subtly. Get off my land, Hammond. Of course. But we'll be back. The railroad always gets what it needs. One way or another. He tipped his hat mockingly toward Mabel. Mrs. Calder. Charming to meet the woman worth $300. They left in a cloud of dust, but the tension lingered like smoke from a grass fire. Vultures, Walter spat. Begging your pardon, ma'am. Mabel stepped fully onto the porch. What water rights? Eli's jaw was tight. Willow Creek cuts through the northern pasture. It's spring-fed, never runs dry. They want to divert it for their steam engines and water stops. Without it, Crown Sea dies. He said it simply, like discussing the weather. Cattle can't survive on wells alone, not in drought years. That evening, the first of the dust storms rolled in. Mabel had seen them before, but never like this, a wall of red-brown that swallowed the sunset and turned day to twilight. The men rushed to secure everything that could blow away, driving the horses into the barn, covering the well. Inside, Eli shouted over the rising wind. Everyone inside! They huddled in the main house, all of them. Propriety be damned. As the storm battered the walls, Mabel had thought to soak cloths in water, and they tied them over their faces as dust seeped through every crack. How long? She asked Walter. Who sat nearest? Could be hours, he said, voice muffled. Seen 'em last days sometimes. The lamp flickered as wind found the chimney. In the strange twilight, she could see Eli standing by the window, watching his land disappear into the storm. Without thinking, she rose and stood beside him. "It'll pass," she said quietly. "Always does. Question is, what's left after?" He glanced at her. "You could have stayed in town. This isn't your fight." "Isn't it?" She touched the window glass, feeling it tremble under the wind's assault. "I'm a Calder now, for better or worse. Says so on paper." "And paper's just paper." "Is it?" She turned to face him fully. "Then why'd you pay $300 for it?" He didn't answer, but something in his expression softened. They stood together, watching the storm rage. While behind them, the men played cards by lamplight and pretended not to notice the moment passing between their boss and his bride. When the wind finally died near midnight, they ventured out to survey the damage. The henhouse had held, though barely. One section of corral fence was down, and the garden Mabel had started was buried under inches of dust. "I'll help you replant," Luis offered. Seeing her dismay, "We all will." Josiah added, "Can't have you going back to feeding us burned beans." It was a small thing, but it warmed her more than she could say. These men, who'd been strangers a week ago, offering to help with women's work because she'd fed them hot meals and taught them letters. The real test came 2 nights later. She woke to the sound of cattle lowing in distress and men shouting. Through her window, she could see torches moving in the darkness. Pulling on her wrapper, she ran toward the commotion. The cattle were milling in panic, pressing against the corral fences. Eli was already there, trying to calm them, but something had them spooked. "Gunshot," Walters said grimly. "Someone fired over their heads, started them running." If the fence gave way, they'd lose half the herd to the darkness and whatever waited out there. Ravines, predators, thieves. Without thinking, Mabel began to sing. It was an old Irish lullaby her mother had used to calm her during storms. Her voice was nothing special, but it was steady and clear in the night air. The nearest cattle turned toward her, ears swiveling. "Keep singing," Eli said softly, moving slowly through the herd. So she did, walking along the fence line, her voice carrying across the dusty ground. The men followed her lead, speaking in low, soothing tones, until gradually the panic eased. The cattle settled, still nervous but no longer pressing to escape. "Well, I'll be damned," Tex muttered. "Pardon, ma'am, but I ain't never seen nothing like that." "My mother always said music gentles the savage beast," Mabel said, suddenly aware of her state of undress, and the way the men were looking at her, not with impropriety, but with something like respect. "Get some rest," Eli told the hands. "We'll post double watch till dawn." As the others dispersed, he walked her back toward her quarters. That was quick thinking. It was just a song. It was what we needed. He paused at her door. "You're full of surprises, Mrs. Calder. Is that good or bad?" "Jury's still out," he said, but there was warmth in it. "Lock your door tonight. Whoever fired that shot is still out there." She did as he said, but sleep wouldn't come. Through her window, she could see him sitting on the porch, rifle across his knees, keeping watch, her husband in name only, protecting the land that sustained them both. In the morning, she brought him coffee without being asked, and they sat in companionable silence as the sun painted the mountains. Neither mentioned the night before, but something had shifted between them. Not love. It was too soon and too complicated for that, but trust, maybe, the beginning of partnership. "Storm's coming," he said, studying the horizon. "Another dust storm. Different kind. Hammond won't give up easy. And Pike's been too quiet since the auction. Men like that don't forgive being made fools of." She thought of Jeb Crow's cold eyes, of Hammond's snake smile, of all the ways powerful men could make life miserable for those who defied them. "Then we'd best be ready," she said simply. He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. I told you, Mr. Calder, I'm a woman who honors her contracts." She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. "Besides, someone needs to keep you and the boys fed while you fight your wars." "Our wars," he corrected quietly, and she knew he meant it. That afternoon, she found a length of good blue cloth in the storage room and began cutting out new curtains for the kitchen. It was a small thing, a tiny claim on this house that wasn't quite hers. But Eli, passing through, stopped to watch her work. "That'll look nice," he said awkwardly, as if complimenting curtains was foreign territory. "A house needs a woman's touch," she said, then bit her lip, worried he'd take it wrong. But he just nodded. It's been missing that for too long. He left before she could ask what he meant. But Luis, helping her hang the fabric later, volunteered the information. "The senora before, Senor Eli's mother, she died when he was just 16. He built this place up alone, with his own hands." The vaquero's voice held deep respect. "He is a good man. Senora, hard, sometimes like the land, but good." That night, a light rain fell, barely enough to settle the dust. But the men treated it like a miracle. They stood in the yard, faces turned skyward, laughing as the drops hit their skin. "Come on." Eli appeared at her door, hat in hand. "Can't waste rain in the desert." She let him lead her outside, where the smell of wet earth rose like perfume. The rain was gentle, more mist than drops, but after the dust and heat, it felt like blessing. "First rain in 3 months, Walters said, grinning like a boy. They stood there, all of them, the artificial barriers of boss and hands, husband and wife, dissolved in the simple joy of water from the sky. When Eli's hand found hers in the darkness, she didn't pull away. It meant nothing, she told herself. Just shared celebration, human contact in a hard land. But when the rain stopped and they went their separate ways, she could still feel the calluses on his palm, the careful strength in his grip. In her room, she pressed her hand to her heart and wondered if honoring contracts and building partnerships could somehow, against all sense, grow into something more. Outside, dawn was still hours away, but already she could hear movement in the barn. Ranch life started early and demanded everything, but for the first time since climbing onto that auction platform, Mabel felt like she might have something to give beyond just obligation, maybe even something to gain beyond mere survival. She lit her lamp and began planning breakfast. Whatever came next, railroad threats, pike schemes, drought, or storm, at least no one would face it on an empty stomach. It wasn't much, but in a land that gave little and demanded much, sometimes the small graces were what kept you human. The blue curtains hung in the window, catching the lamplight, a tiny flag of domesticity in a wild land. Tomorrow there would be more challenges, more threats, more dust. But tonight, for just a moment, Crown Sea felt almost like home. The sandstorm struck at midday, turning the world sepia and stealing the breath from their lungs. It came from the north like a living wall, swallowing the mountains, the range, everything in its path. Mabel had seen storms before, but this was different, deliberate in its fury, as if the desert itself had declared war on Crown Sea. "Everyone inside," Eli's voice barely carried over the howling wind. "Secure what you can." Mabel rushed to help Luis wrestle the chicken coop door closed, while Josiah and the brothers fought to cover the well. The wind tore at her skirts, driving sand that stung like needles into every exposed inch of skin. "The feed barn," Walter shouted, pointing at the structure where their winter hay was stored. The door had torn loose, banging like a drummer's call to arms. Without thinking, Mabel ran for it. If they lost the feed, the cattle would starve come winter. She heard Eli shout her name, but the wind grabbed it and flung it away. Her world narrowed to the space between her and that swinging door, each step a battle against the storm's fury. She reached the barn just as a gust lifted the door completely off its hinges. Throwing herself forward, She grabbed the sacks of grain nearest the opening, dragging them back from the wind's reach. Sand filled her mouth, her eyes, her lungs, but she kept pulling, kept saving what she could. Strong hands joined hers. Eli, his face masked with a bandana but his eyes unmistakable above it. Together they formed a chain with the other men, passing sacks hand to hand, deeper into the barn. When the last bag was secure, Eli pulled her against the wall, sheltering her with his body as they fought to tie down a canvas over the gaping doorway. By the time the storm passed, 3 hours later, they were all ghost pale with dust, coughing and spitting grit. The damage was extensive. Fences down, the garden buried again, one corner of the bunkhouse roof torn away. But the feed was saved, the animals were alive, and no one was seriously hurt. "You're a fool," Eli said quietly, finding Mabel by the water barrel where she was trying to rinse the sand from her hair. His voice was rough, though whether from dust or emotion, she couldn't tell. "Could have been killed running into that storm." "So could you," she countered, wringing out her hair. "But the feed—" "Can be replaced? You can't." The words hung between them, heavier than he'd perhaps intended. He cleared his throat. "Just be careful. This land takes enough without us giving it easy opportunities." That night, as they worked by lamplight to repair what they could, young Tom made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been clearing debris from near the well when his shovel hit something that didn't belong. "Mr. Calder," he called, voice tight with worry. "You need to see this." They gathered around as Tom brushed away the sand, revealing a cluster of leaves and berries that made Walter curse and step back. "Loco weed," the older man said grimly. "Devil's own plant. Makes animals go crazy, then kills them slow." "This didn't blow here," Eli said, examining the pile. It had been deliberately placed, weighted down with rocks. "Someone poisoned our water." The implications settled over them like a shroud. If the cattle had drunk from the well, if they hadn't caught it in time. "I found this too," Tom added, holding up a small metal object. In the lamplight, they could see it was a cufflink, brass with the initials J.C. etched in fancy script. "Jeb Crow," Luis spat. "Pike's dog." Eli's face was stone. "We can't prove it, not in any court that Pike doesn't own." "Then what do we do?" Sam asked, young face worried. "We watch," Mabel said quietly. All eyes turned to her. "We watch, we document everything, and we wait for them to make a mistake. My mother used to say that evil men always hang themselves if you give them enough rope." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Walter said approvingly. "She was—" Mabel pocketed the cufflink, "and she taught me to keep receipts." The next morning brought an unwelcome visit. Reverend Pike arrived with a small group of townspeople, including Mrs. Harlan and several members of his congregation. They stayed mounted, arranged like a jury outside the main house. "Hey, Mr. Calder." Pike's voice carried that false concern he wore like cologne. "We've come to express our worry about the unnatural events plaguing your ranch." "Nothing unnatural about sandstorms in Arizona," Eli replied, standing on the porch with his arms crossed. "Perhaps not, but when combined with sick cattle, poisoned wells, and midnight disturbances—" Pike let the words hang. "Some in town are saying you've brought a curse upon yourself. Marriage built on greed rather than godliness. Choose your next words careful. Reverend." Eli's voice was soft, which somehow made it more dangerous. But Mabel stepped forward before blood could be drawn. "If there's a curse here, Reverend Pike, it walks on 2 legs and leaves brass cufflinks by poisoned wells." She held up the evidence, watching Pike's eyes narrow, and Crow, lurking at the back of the group, shift in his saddle. "That proves nothing," Pike said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Maybe not in court," Mabel agreed. "But the Lord sees all. Doesn't he even things done in darkness? She met each townsperson's eyes in turn. Ask yourselves why a man of God spends so much time worrying about business that isn't his. Ask why he's so interested in seeing this ranch fail.
"How dare you, Mrs.?"
Harlan began, but Mabel cut her off. I dare because I have nothing left to lose. I've already been sold like livestock, called cursed, had my father's honest name dragged through mud. What more can you take from me? She felt Eli's presence at her back, solid as a wall. But I'll tell you what you can't take, my self-respect. My marriage may have started in necessity, but every day I choose to honor it. Every meal I cook, every lesson I teach, every dawn I rise to face whatever this land throws at us, that's my choice. And if that threatens you somehow, Reverend, then maybe you need to examine your own soul. The silence stretched taut as fence wire. Then, from the back of the group, old Samuel Morrison, who ran the livery stable and generally kept his own counsel, spoke up. Girl's got a point. Silas, you have been mighty interested in Calder's business lately. I'm concerned for their souls. Concerned for their land, more like, another voice muttered. Though Mabel couldn't see who, Pike's face darkened like the sky before a storm. We'll pray for you, he said stiffly. Both of you. Pride goes before a fall. And false witness is a sin. Mabel shot back. I'll pray for you too, Reverend, that you find whatever peace you're looking for without destroying others to get it. The group departed in disarray, some following Pike immediately, others lingering as if reluctant to leave. Old Morrison tipped his hat to Mabel before he went, a gesture of respect that warmed her more than she could say. You've made an enemy, Eli said quietly once they were alone. I already had one. Now at least it's in the open. She turned to face him. I won't apologize for defending us. Us, he repeated, that word again. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. Remind me never to get on your bad side, Mrs. Calder. That evening, as she prepared supper, she found herself humming. It was hard work, this life harder than anything she'd known in town, but there was something clean about it too. The men treated her with respect. The work had purpose, and Eli was still a mystery, but one she was beginning to want to solve. She was pulling cornbread from the oven when it happened. A cry from outside, then running feet. Through the window, she saw Luis supporting Tom, the boy's face white with pain, his ankle bent at an unnatural angle. Spooked horse, Luis explained as they got the boy inside. Kicked out when something startled it. Mabel took charge immediately, sending Josiah for cold water and Walter for the medical supplies. She'd helped her father tend enough injuries at the forge to know what to do. This is going to hurt, she warned Tom, hands gentle but firm on his ankle. Bite on this. She gave him a leather strap. With Eli holding the boy steady, she manipulated the joint back into place with a quick, decisive movement. Tom's cry was muffled by the leather, tears streaming down his young face, but the relief was immediate. Just a bad sprain, she said, wrapping it carefully. You'll be off it for a week at least. A week, Tom protested. But the drive can wait, Eli said firmly. Or go without you, your choice, but you're not riding with that ankle. Later, as the boy rested on a makeshift bed in the main room, his brother hovering anxiously nearby, Mabel found herself alone with Eli on the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered like spilled salt across the black table of sky. You did good today, he said, with Tom, with Pike, with everything. I did what needed doing. That's what I mean. He was quiet for a moment. I bought time when I married you. Didn't expect to get a partner in the bargain. The word hung between them, laden with possibility. Partner. Not wife, not woman, but partner. Equal. Is that what we are? She asked softly. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight, she could see something shifting in his expression, walls coming down brick by careful brick. "I'd like us to be, if you're willing." She thought about the morning's confrontation, the storm they'd weathered together, the simple rhythm of shared work and shared meals, thought about brass cufflinks and poisoned wells and the threats still circling like buzzards. "Partners it is," she said, and offered her hand to shake on it. His hand engulfed hers, calloused and strong, but gentle too. They held on a moment longer than necessary, and when he let go, she felt the loss of it. "We should check the well again," he said, voice rougher than usual. "Make sure it's running clean." They walked together through the darkness, not touching but aware of each other in every step. At the well. Eli drew up the bucket, and they both smelled it carefully. Clean water, nothing more. "They'll try again," Mabel said. "Let them." His voice was grim but determined. "We'll be ready." As they walked back, a sound made them both freeze horses, moving fast through the darkness. Eli pushed Mabel behind him, hand dropping to his gun, but the riders passed by without stopping, heading toward town.
Railroad men,
he said, recognizing their shapes.
"Riding hard. Something's happened."
They'd find out soon enough what new trouble was brewing. But for tonight, the ranch was quiet, the stars were bright, and they were partners in truth as well as law. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was trust. And in this hard land, trust might be worth even more. Inside, Tom was sleeping peacefully, his brother dozing in a chair beside him. The other men had drifted to their bunks, leaving the main room warm with lamplight and the lingering smell of cornbread. "Thank you," Eli said suddenly, "for choosing to stay, for fighting beside us, for—" He stopped, struggling with words that didn't come easy. "Just thank you." Mabel felt her heart turn over in her chest, a slow, sweet revolution. "Partners don't need to thank each other for doing what's right," she said softly, "but you're welcome all the same." She left him there, standing in the lamplight, and made her way to her own quarters. Through her window, she could see him later, making his rounds, checking locks and latches, protecting what was his, what was theirs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Pike wouldn't forget her defiance. The railroad men's midnight ride promised fresh troubles. And somewhere in the darkness, Jeb Crow was likely planning his next move. But tonight, she had a home, a purpose, and a partner. In a land that promised nothing and took everything it could, that felt like riches beyond measure. She fell asleep to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the creak of the windmill turning in the night breeze, dreaming of clean water and strong hands and a future that might, against all odds, be worth fighting for. The saloon had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom, with tables pushed together and lanterns hung from every beam to chase away the shadows. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey, though most men had corked their bottles out of respect for the proceedings. Deputy Marshal Cole Bennett, a lean man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, sat behind the bar that served as his bench. "This isn't a formal trial," Bennett announced to the packed room. "But given the serious nature of the accusations flying around, I figured we'd better sort truth from fiction before somebody gets killed." Mabel sat beside Eli at a table facing the crowd. She'd worn her best dress, the blue calico from the auction day, and kept her hands folded to hide their trembling. Across the room, Reverend Pike held court with his supporters, Jeb Crow lounging against the wall behind him like a shadow given form. "Let's start simple," Bennett continued. "Mrs. Calder, you've accused certain parties of poisoning wells and attempting to drive off Crown C cattle. You got evidence." Mabel stood, producing the brass cufflink. "Found this by our well, along with loco weed that had been deliberately placed to poison our water supply." "That could belong to anyone," Pike interjected smoothly. "Cufflinks are common enough." "True," Mabel agreed. But how many men in Dry Creek have the initials JC and wear brass cufflinks with pearl inlay? Crow shifted, and several heads turned to look at him. His vest gaped slightly where a button was missing, right where a cufflink would typically catch. Circumstantial, Pike said, but sweat beaded on his upper lip. Then let's discuss facts, a new voice said from the doorway. Frederick Hammond entered with 2 other railroad men, their city clothes dusty from hard riding. Gentlemen, I have some interesting information about land deals and water rights. Eli tensed beside her, but Hammond held up a hand. Peace, Calder. I'm not here as your enemy today. He produced a leather portfolio. 3 weeks ago, someone approached the railroad with an offer, said they'd have control of Crown Sea's water rights within the month, offered to sell them to us for twice what we'd offered you. Who? Bennett demanded. The signature was illegible, but the return address was care of Reverend Pike's church. Hammond's smile was sharp. We don't do business with thieves. Marshal, bad for our reputation. The room erupted. Pike's supporters turned uncertain, whispering among themselves. Old Morrison stood up from the back. I got something to say, too. Horace Bell came by my stable last week. Wanted to rent a wagon. Said Pike had promised him first option on Crown Sea when it went to auction for debt default. Seemed mighty sure it would happen soon. Lies. Pike surged to his feet. This is persecution of a man of God. Then explain this, another voice called out. Jake Mueller, who ran the general store's loading dock, stepped forward. I saw Crow buying loco weed from that Mexican trader last month. Thought it was strange, him not having any livestock. The evidence mounted like stones in a wall. The barkeep remembered Pike meeting with Bell after hours. A ranch hand from a neighboring spread had seen riders near Crown Sea the night the cattle spooked. Even Mrs. Harlan, Pike's supporter, admitted she'd overheard him discussing earthly rewards for heavenly work. Enough. Pike's composure cracked like dried mud. You fools don't understand. This land is wasted on the likes of Calder, playing at marriage with a fallen woman. Careful, Eli warned, starting to rise. But Mabel put a hand on his arm. Let him talk. The truth always shows itself when angry men open their mouths. Truth, Pike laughed bitterly. The truth is that this territory needs civilization, progress. The railroad, not stubborn fools who'd rather scratch in the dirt than accept the future. That water should serve hundreds, not a few dozen cattle. So you tried to steal it, Bennett said flatly. Not steal. Facilitate transition to rightful ownership. Pike's eyes blazed with fervor. Sometimes the Lord works through earthly means. Like poisoning wells and terrorizing folks. Walter spoke up from where the Crown Sea men stood together. That's a funny kind of gospel. Reverend, what you did was break the law. Bennett said, conspiracy, destruction of property, attempted theft through fraudulent means. He looked at Crow. And you're going to tell me everything, aren't you, Mr. Crow? Crow looked between Pike and the deputy marshal. Calculating his options. Self-preservation 1. He paid me $50 to spook the cattle, 20 more to plant the loco weed. Said God wanted the railroad to prosper and we were doing holy work. Pike went white. You Judas. That's enough testimony for me, Bennett declared. Silas Pike, you're under arrest. Crow, you too, though I expect the judge might go easier on you for cooperating. He turned to Hammond. The railroad willing to testify to what you've told us. Gladly, we want the water rights, but we'll negotiate fairly for them. Bad business otherwise. Hammond tipped his hat to Mabel. Your wife's a clever woman. Calder, keeping that evidence was smart. As the deputies, hastily sworn townsmen, led Pike and Crow away. The saloon erupted in discussion. Some of Pike's congregation looked lost, others ashamed. But old Morrison raised his glass toward Eli and Mabel's table. To the Calders, for showing us that righteousness and religion ain't always the same thing." The toast was taken up by others, even some who'd stood with Pike that morning at the ranch. Mabel felt Eli's hand find hers under the table, a brief squeeze of shared relief. "We should go," he murmured, "before this turns into a celebration we don't need." They slipped out into the cool night air, where the stars were just beginning to show. The walk to where they'd left the wagon was quiet, both of them processing what had just happened. "You did it," Eli said finally. "Stood up to them all and won." "We did it," she corrected. "Partners, remember?" He stopped walking, turning to face her in the dim light from the saloon windows. "Mabel, He paused, struggling with words. "I need to tell you something. About the money." Her heart sank. "What about it?" "I had it. The $300. Could have paid my own debts with it. Kept the bank at bay another season." He met her eyes steadily. "But when I saw you on that platform, saw what they were trying to do, I couldn't let it happen. Not to anyone. But especially not to you." "Why?" The word came out whispered. "Because I'd seen you around town, working that forge when your father couldn't, teaching those Mexican children their letters behind the church, never complaining even when folks treated you poorly." He took a breath. "Because you deserved better than being sold to the highest bidder. Because maybe I hoped." "Hoped what?" "That a marriage started in kindness might grow into something more than paper and convenience." The night air suddenly felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Mabel's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Eli, Shouts from the saloon interrupted whatever she might have said. They turned to see men pouring out onto the street, some carrying torches. "Fire!" someone yelled. "Fire at Crown C!" The ride back was a nightmare of pounding hooves and racing hearts. They could see the glow from miles away, orange against the night sky. Mabel clung to the wagon seat as Eli pushed the horses harder than was safe, wheels bouncing over ruts that could have overturned them. They crested the final rise to see the feed barn ablaze, flames reaching hungry fingers toward the sky. The ranch hands had formed a bucket brigade from the well, but it was clearly a losing battle. "The horses!" Luis shouted, pointing to the main barn where panicked whinnies could be heard. Without hesitation, Mabel jumped from the still-moving wagon and ran toward the barn. The smoke was thick, stinging her eyes, but she could hear the animal's terror. She grabbed a saddle blanket, dunked it in a water trough, and wrapped it around her head and shoulders before plunging inside. The horses were rearing in their stalls, eyes rolling white with fear. She went to Buttermilk first, the gentle mare she'd ridden from town that first day, speaking in the same soothing tones she'd used on the panicked cattle. "Easy, girl. Easy now. We're getting out of here." One by one, she led them out, Eli and the men taking them as she brought them to safety. Her lungs burned. Her eyes streamed, but she kept going back until every animal was safe. The feed barn was lost, along with half their winter hay, but no lives, human or animal, were claimed by the flames. As dawn broke over the devastation, they stood in exhausted groups, faces blackened with soot, watching the last of the embers die. "How?" Walter asked wearily. Young Tom, hobbling on his injured ankle, held up something that glinted in the early light. "Found this by where it started. Coal oil can. Still got some in it." "Pike couldn't have done this," Josiah said. "He was in jail by then." "He's got friends," Eli said grimly. "Or had. Question is whether they'll keep coming now that he's locked up." As if in answer, riders appeared on the horizon. Everyone tensed, hands moving to weapons, but as they got closer, Mabel recognized old Morrison leading a group of townspeople. "Saw the smoke," Morrison called out. "Brought help." They had indeed, wagons loaded with supplies, timber for rebuilding, even bales of hay, missus. Harlan was among them, her usual stern expression replaced by something almost like shame. "I was wrong," she said simply. approaching Mabel. "About you, about Pike, about all of it. This isn't much, but it's a start on making amends." Throughout the morning, more arrived. The banker Hammond had threatened brought a note forgiving interest on Eli's loans. The Mexican families whose children Mabel had taught brought food and willing hands. Even some of Pike's former congregation came, quietly joining the rebuilding efforts. "Never seen anything like it," Walter murmured, watching the barn frame rise again under dozens of helping hands. "Usually folks just watch when a ranch fails." "We didn't fail," Eli said, his eyes on Mabel as she directed the placement of salvaged supplies. "We just found out who our real neighbors are." As the sun climbed higher, Mabel found herself working beside Eli, holding boards while he hammered. Their shoulders touched, and neither pulled away. "About last night," he said quietly. "What I was trying to say—" "I know," she interrupted. "And Eli, that hope you mentioned, it wasn't just yours." He stopped hammering, looking at her with something like wonder. Around them, the sounds of construction continued. Hammers ringing, saws singing, voices calling out measurements and jokes. But for just that moment, they might have been alone in the world. "When this is done," he said, "when we've got Crown C back on its feet, I want to court you proper. Do this right." "We're already married," she pointed out, amused. "Legal married and heart married are different things." His weathered face was serious. "You deserve the difference." Before she could respond, Josiah called out for more nails. And the moment passed, but the promise lingered in the air between them like the smell of sawdust and hope. By sunset, the new barn frame stood proud against the sky, not quite complete but solid enough to promise future shelter. The townspeople began drifting away, leaving the Crown C folks to assess their situation. "We lost maybe a third of the feed," Walter calculated. "Going to be tight come winter. Hammond says the railroad will pay fair price for limited water access." Eli said, "Just for their construction crews, temporary, might be enough to buy what we need." "And I can take in sewing," Mabel added. "Several of the town women asked about it today." It was a far cry from the empire Pike had tried to steal, but it was theirs, earned through honest work and defended by community. As the stars began to appear, Mabel stood with her chosen family, for that's what they'd become, and felt rich beyond measure. "One more thing," Luis said, producing a bottle he'd hidden in the ruins of the old barn. "Save this for a special occasion. Think rebuilding after someone tried to burn us out counts." They passed the bottle around, even Mabel taking a small sip that burned like liquid fire down her throat. When it came back to Eli, he raised it high. "To partners," he said, looking directly at her. "To neighbors, to second chances and new beginnings. To home," Mabel added softly, and in the chorus of agreement that followed, she heard the true sound of victory, not in Pike's defeat or the barn rebuilt, but in the voices of people who'd chosen to stand together against whatever the desert might throw at them next. The night wind carried the smell of fresh-cut lumber and the last traces of smoke. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, winter to prepare for, loans to manage, a ranch to run. But tonight, with Eli's hand finding hers in the darkness and the warm glow of friendship all around, Mabel Quinn Calder knew she'd found something worth more than gold. She'd found a place to stand and fight. She'd found a purpose worth having. And maybe, just maybe, she'd found a love worth waiting for, worth building as carefully as any barn, board by board and nail by nail, until it could weather any storm the Arizona Territory could send. The rain came like a miracle in reverse. Too much, too fast. After months of drought, the sky opened up just after midnight, turning the dry arroyos into raging torrents within hours. Mabel woke to the sound of Luis pounding on her door. "Senora! The cattle, they're trapped on the north side. The creek is flooding." She dressed quickly, pulling on the oil slicker Eli had given her just days before. Outside, the world had transformed into a chaos of water and mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating sheets of rain that fell sideways in the wind. Eli was already at the corral, saddling horses with grim efficiency. Rivers jumped its banks. Got about 30 head stuck on that rise near Willow Creek. If the water keeps rising, he didn't need to finish. Mabel had seen enough floods to know what happened to cattle caught in rising water. "I'm coming with you," she said.
No.
His response was automatic, protective, too dangerous. "You need every hand. I can ride. I can rope." She met his eyes steadily. "Partners. Remember." He held her gaze for a long moment, rain streaming down both their faces. Then he nodded once. "Sharp. Stay close. Do exactly what I say." They rode out into the storm. Eli, Mabel, Walter, Josiah, and Luis. Leaving the younger boys to watch the ranch, the normally placid creek had become a monster. Brown water carrying debris, whole trees spinning in the current like toys. The cattle were huddled on a shrinking island of high ground, bellowing their fear into the wind. The water was rising fast, already lapping at their hooves. "We'll have to drive them through the shallow spot upstream," Eli shouted over the storm. "Before it gets any deeper." They spread out, working to turn the frightened animals toward the crossing. It was treacherous work, the horses sliding in mud. Visibility almost zero, except when lightning cracked overhead. Mabel's mare stumbled, nearly going down, but she kept her seat, kept pushing forward. Then disaster struck. A massive cottonwood, torn from its roots upstream, came spinning down the flood. It slammed into the bank right where Josiah was working, the impact sending a wall of water over both man and horse. "Josiah!" Walter's cry was nearly lost in the storm. The big man and his mount disappeared into the churning brown water. Without thinking, Mabel kicked her mare forward, riding hard along the bank, eyes searching the flood. There, a dark shape struggling against the current. She uncoiled her rope, the lessons Luis had been giving her flooding back. One chance. She swung wide, released, and by God's grace or sheer luck, the loop found its target. Josiah's hand closed on the rope just as his horse found footing on a submerged sandbar. "Pull!" she screamed to the others, wrapping the rope around her saddle horn. Together they hauled man and horse from the hungry water. Josiah collapsed on solid ground, coughing up muddy water but alive. "The cattle," Eli pointed. The temporary dam formed by the cottonwood was backing up water fast. The cattle's island was disappearing before their eyes. There was no time for the upstream crossing now. "We go straight across," Eli decided. "Fast and hard before they scatter." It was madness, but it was their only chance. They charged into the water, using their horses to push the cattle forward. The current was strong, trying to sweep them all downstream. Mabel felt her mare swimming now, powerful legs churning against the flood. A young calf went under, pulled by the current. Mabel lunged, grabbing its ear, hauling its head above water. Her horse struggled with the extra weight, and for a terrifying moment she thought they'd all go down. Then Eli was there, taking the calf's weight. His strength added to hers. Together they fought through to the far bank, cattle and horses scrambling up the muddy slope. They made 3 more crossings, saving every head, though by the end both humans and animals were exhausted. But the night's trials weren't over. As they turned toward home, Walter pointed to an orange glow on the horizon. Not dawn, which was still hours away, but fire. "That's not the barn," Luis said, voice tight. "That's the hay shed." They raced back to find the shed fully engulfed, flames defying the rain through sheer intensity. Someone had used coal oil, lots of it, to ensure the fire would catch despite the weather. "Let it burn," Eli ordered as some of the hands moved to fight it. "Save what's in the barn. Move everything you can." They worked frantically, creating a firebreak, moving equipment and feed away from the flames. It was then that Mabel spotted him, a figure slipping away from the chaos, heading for the main house. The documents, she realized with horror. All their papers, Deeds, contracts, the marriage certificate that protected the ranch were in Eli's desk. She ran, feet sliding in the mud, bursting through the front door to find Horace Bell rifling through the desk drawers, a lamp dangerously close to spilling on the scattered papers. "Looking for something?" she asked, breathing hard. Bell spun, his usually composed banker's face twisted with desperation.
You've ruined everything Pike promised.
He lunged for the lamp. Mabel moved faster, sweeping it away from the papers. They struggled, Bell surprisingly strong for his soft appearance. The lamp crashed to the floor, oil spreading but thankfully not igniting. Then a shadow filled the doorway. Jeb Crow stood there, water streaming from his coat, and Mabel's heart sank, caught between two enemies, papers that could save the ranch scattered around her. But Crow didn't move to help Bell. Instead, he spoke, voice rough with something that might have been conscience. "That's enough, Horace."
What are you doing?
Bell snarled. "Pike said you'd—" "Pike's done, and I'm tired of being his dog." Crow looked at Mabel, something almost like regret in his eyes. "Ma'am, you spoke true at that trial, about two-legged curses and choosing what kind of man to be. I made my choice wrong for a long time." Trader Bell pulled a derringer from his coat. The next moments happened fast. Crow lunged forward, knocking Bell's arm up. The gun fired, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling. They struggled, and then both men crashed through the window onto the porch beyond. Mabel heard the sounds of fighting, then silence. She grabbed the scattered documents, stuffing them into a leather portfolio, then cautiously approached the window. Bell lay unconscious in the mud. Crow sat against the porch rail, blood seeping between the fingers pressed to his side. "He had a knife," Crow said unnecessarily. "Figures a banker would fight dirty." "Don't move," Mabel said, tearing strips from her petticoat. "I need to stop the bleeding."
Why?
Crow's laugh was bitter. "After what I done." "Because everyone deserves a second chance," she said firmly, pressing the makeshift bandage to his wound. "Even two-legged curses who choose to walk different." Eli and the others arrived then. Having seen the struggle from outside, Doc Morrison was sent for, arriving as dawn broke gray and watery through the dissipating storm.
"He'll live,"
the doctor pronounced after examining Crow. "Missed anything vital? Lucky man." "Lucky nothing," Walter said. "Man finally grew a conscience is all." Bell was taken to town to await federal marshals. His attempted destruction of legal documents was a serious crime. Crow, bandaged and wan, gave a full confession to Deputy Bennett about Pike's schemes and his own part in them. "I'll do my time," Crow said quietly. "But I wanted to set things right first. Pike had plans. See, other men involved, railroad speculators, land grabbers. Crown C was just the beginning." As the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, Mabel stood surveying the damage. The hayshed was a total loss. Fences down, debris everywhere, but the cattle were safe, the ranch documents secure, and no lives lost. "It'll take weeks to clean up," Walter said wearily. "Months to recover the losses," Eli added. He looked exhausted, muddy, his shirt torn from the night's work. "But we will recover," Mabel said firmly. "We always do." Eli moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Around them, the hands began the cleanup despite their exhaustion. The routine of ranch work continuing regardless of floods or fires or the schemes of desperate men. "You saved Josiah," Eli said quietly. "Face down Bell alone. Doctored Crow despite everything." He turned to look at her fully. "I've known seasoned cowboys who wouldn't have done half what you did tonight." "I did what needed doing." She was swaying on her feet now, exhaustion hitting like a wall. "No." His arm came around her, steady and sure. "You did more. You showed mercy to an enemy. You risked everything for people who started as strangers. You—" He stopped, seeming to realize the others were carefully not watching them. "I'm taking my wife inside," he announced. "She needs rest. Walter, you're in charge of cleanup. Send someone to town for supplies. Hammond said the railroad would extend credit after last night's revelations." He guided her to the house, past the broken window already being boarded by Luis, through the muddy main room, to the kitchen where he insisted she sit while he built up the fire. "Eli, I should help." "You've helped enough." He set coffee to brewing, movement sufficient despite his own exhaustion. "Time someone took care of you for a change." The simple kindness of it, after a night of violence and storms and near death, undid her. Tears came suddenly, all the fear and adrenaline releasing at once. "Hey now," Eli said softly, kneeling beside her chair. "It's over. We won." "I could have lost you," she managed. "In the flood, when you went under for that moment, I thought, I'm here." He took her hands in his, mud-stained and shaking. "We're both here. That's what matters." They stayed like that, hands clasped, foreheads almost touching, while the coffee boiled over and neither of them cared. Outside, the sounds of recovery continued. Hammers and saws, voices calling instructions, life going on as it always did after disaster. "Mabel," Eli said finally, his voice rough. "I know I said I'd court you proper, but after tonight, I need you to know, you're not just my partner. You're not just the woman who saved my ranch. You're—" "I know," she whispered. "I know. Eli, me too." He kissed her then, soft and careful, as if she might break. But she was not broken. She was forged in flood and fire, tempered by trials that would have shattered a weaker soul. She kissed him back with all the fierce joy of survival, of finding home in the most unexpected place. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was fully up, streaming through the kitchen window and setting the dust motes dancing like gold. "We should help the others," Mabel said, though she made no move to rise. "In a minute." Eli's thumb traced circles on her palm. "Just let me look at you a minute. My wife, my actual, real, chosen wife." "Covered in mud and smelling like wet horse," she laughed, suddenly self-conscious. "Beautiful," he corrected. "Absolutely beautiful." Later, when they emerged to join the cleanup, Mabel noticed the knowing smiles from the hands, the way Walter started whistling a wedding tune before Josiah elbowed him quiet. But she didn't mind. Let them see. Let the whole territory know that what had started as a business arrangement had become something real. The work was hard, would be hard for months to come. But as she worked alongside her husband, her partner, her choice, Mabel felt the truth Pike had never understood. You couldn't buy or steal what really mattered. Love, loyalty, the bonds of chosen family. These things could only be earned, one shared trial at a time. One act of courage building on another until you'd created something no flood could wash away, no fire could burn. "Hey, Senora O," Luis called from the barn. "That calf you saved is looking for its breakfast." "Coming," she called back, then quieter, to Eli. "Together." Always, he promised. And together they walked toward whatever work the day would bring. Partners in truth at last. The federal courthouse in Prescott was a far cry from the makeshift saloon trial, built of solid stone with high windows and polished wood benches. It represented the law's reach even into the wild territories. Judge William Thornburg presided, a silver-haired man with eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for seeing through lies like glass. Mabel sat in the witness chair, her hands folded in her lap, wearing the new green dress Eli had insisted on buying for the occasion. "You're testifying for our future," he'd said. "You should look like the lady you are. State your name for the record." The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, instructed Mabel Quinn Calder. "Mrs. Calder, please tell the court about the events leading to your marriage." She took a breath, meeting the judge's eyes directly. My father owed money to Mr. Bell's bank, money for coal that turned out to be mostly slate and worthless rock. When father fell ill and couldn't work, Reverend Pike arranged what he called a charitable auction to settle the debts. What kind of auction? The kind where a woman's labor and expected marriage goes to the highest bidder. She kept her voice steady. Factual. People say I carry bad luck, Judge Thornburg, that I'm too educated, too proud, too much of everything a woman shouldn't be. But what I am is practical. My father needed help, and I had only myself to offer. And Mr. Calder purchased your contract? He paid my father's debt, yes, $300 cash, but he never treated me as property. From the first day, he made clear I was to be respected as mistress of Crown C with my own quarters and my own choices. The defense attorney, representing Pike and Bell, stood. Yet you claim this was all part of an elaborate scheme. Not the marriage. That was... She paused, choosing words carefully. An unexpected mercy, but yes, Pike and Bell conspired to force the auction, hoping to gain control of Crown C through whoever won the bidding. Do you have proof? I have this. She produced the brass cufflink. Found by our poisoned well. I have the testimony of railroad men who were offered our water rights before we even knew they were in danger. I have Jeb Crow's confession, and I have this. From her bag, she pulled a small leather journal. Pike's own record book, retrieved from the church after his arrest. It details payments made, plans laid, and his certainty that God intended the railroad to prosper through any means necessary. The journal caused a stir. Pike, sitting at the defendant's table, went pale as ash. How did you obtain this? The judge asked sharply. Reverend Pike's housekeeper, Maria Santos, brought it to me. She said she'd watched him destroy the poor for years while preaching charity. She wanted the truth known. Davis took the journal, flipping through pages. Your Honor, this appears to detail a conspiracy involving not just the defendants, but several other prominent citizens, bribes, threats, planned foreclosures. I'll review it in chambers, Thornburg said. Continue. Mrs. Calder. She told it all then, the storms, the poisoned water, the fired barn, Bell's attempt to destroy their documents, Crow's change of heart. She spoke simply, without embellishment, letting the facts carry their own weight. You paint yourself as quite the heroine, the defense attorney said with false sympathy. A poor girl rising above her circumstances. How convenient that you ended up married to one of the territory's most successful ranchers. Successful? Mabel's temper flared. Crown C was weeks from foreclosure when I arrived. We've fought drought, flood, and fire. Every penny we have is earned with sweat and sacrifice, if that's your definition of convenient. Sir, I'd hate to see difficult. A ripple of laughter ran through the gallery. Even the judge's mouth twitched. No further questions, the lawyer said stiffly. Eli testified next, his presence filling the room. He confirmed Mabel's account, adding details about the railroad's pressure tactics and the suspicious timing of their disasters. Why did you really marry Mrs. Calder? Davis asked. Eli was quiet for a moment. Started out as mutual need. The law protects married homesteaders, gives them a year's grace from foreclosure. I needed that protection, and Miss Quinn needed out of a bad situation. But, sir, I've been in this territory 20 years. I've faced down rustlers, Apache raids, and nature's worst. Nothing prepared me for the courage of the woman I married. She saved my ranch, my men, and probably my life more than once. So if you're asking why I married her, it's because I'm not a fool. When God drops a miracle in your lap, you hold on tight. Mabel felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her eyes forward, professional. The most dramatic moment came when Jeb Crow took the stand, bandaged and pale from his wound. He'd been brought from the territorial prison to testify. I did wrong, he said simply. Followed Pike because he had power and I liked how that felt. Poisoned wells, spooked cattle, set fires, all on his orders, all for money. He looked directly at Mabel. But that woman showed me mercy when I deserved none, doctored my wound after I'd tried to burn her home. That kind of grace. It changes a man, or shows him he can change. Anyway, you're saying you found religion, the defense attorney sneered. No, sir, I found conscience, different thing entirely. Pike's testimony, when it came, was a masterpiece of self-delusion. He claimed divine guidance, painted himself as a victim of misunderstanding, insisted his only goal was bringing civilization to the wilderness. And this civilization required theft, arson, and attempted murder. Judge Thornburg asked dryly. Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways. Not that mysterious. The judge cut him off. I've heard enough. The deliberation was brief. When Thornburg returned, his expression was granite. Silas Pike, Horace Bell, the evidence against you is overwhelming. Conspiracy to defraud, destruction of property, attempted theft through fraudulent means, intimidation, and arson. Mr. Pike, you've hidden behind your collar while perpetrating crimes that would shame any honest thief. At least they don't pretend God endorses their work. He detailed the sentences: 5 years hard labor for Pike, 3 for Bell, reduced time for Crow in recognition of his cooperation and reform. But more importantly, he ordered full restitution to all victims of their schemes. Furthermore, Thornburg continued, this court recognizes the marriage of Eli and Mabel Calder as lawful and valid, entered into freely by both parties regardless of the circumstances that brought them together. Any debts incurred by the Quinn family through fraudulent means are hereby vacated. Court dismissed. The gallery erupted. Friends and neighbors who'd traveled from Dry Creek surrounded them with congratulations. Old Morrison pumped Eli's hand while Mrs. Harlan, of all people, embraced Mabel. Gave that lawyer what for? The older woman said approvingly. About time someone did. Outside the courthouse, Hammond approached with several railroad executives. Mr. Calder, Mrs. Calder. He tipped his hat. The railroad owes you an apology. We should have investigated Pike's offer more thoroughly. We'd like to make amends. How? Eli's tone was cautious. Fair payment for limited water access, as discussed. But also, we're establishing a fund for locals affected by land schemes. Your testimony exposed a network of corruption we're committed to rooting out. We'd like you both to serve on the oversight committee. Mabel and Eli exchanged glances. Trust would take time, but it was a start. We'll consider it, Eli said finally. The ride home was quiet at first, both of them processing the day's events. As they left Prescott behind, entering the open country that led to Crown Sea, Eli suddenly pulled the wagon to a stop. What's wrong? Mabel asked. Nothing. Everything. He turned to face her fully. Mabel, that judge said our marriage was lawful and valid. But I need to know, is it real, not the paper? Not the legal parts, but us. She studied his face. This man who'd paid gold for her freedom, who'd stood beside her through every trial, who'd called her a miracle in open court. It's real, she said softly. More real than anything I've ever known. Then I want to do something. He climbed down from the wagon, then reached up to help her down. There, on the side of the dusty road with Purple Mountains as witness, he knelt in the dirt. Mabel Quinn Calder, I married you for protection and convenience, but I'm asking you now to marry me again, for love and choice and all the days we have left. Will you have me not as payment for debt or shelter from storms, but as the man who loves you true? Tears blurred her vision. Eli Calder, you impossible, wonderful fool. Yes, yes to all of it. He stood, pulling her into an embrace that lifted her off her feet, spinning her around while she laughed and held on tight. When he set her down, they were both grinning like youngsters. When? She asked. How? Soon as we get home. Proper ceremony this time. with flowers and music and everyone invited. Walter can give you away, and Luis can play that fiddle he's been hiding." "You knew about the fiddle." "I know everything that happens on my ranch," he said, then softer. "Our ranch." They climbed back on the wagon and continued home. But everything felt different now. The landscape looked brighter, the future clearer. As Crown C came into view, Mabel saw the hands had hung banners from the barn. "Welcome home, champions of justice," painted in uneven letters. Luis's idea? I'd bet. Eli chuckled. The celebration that night was one for the books. Food appeared from nowhere. Neighbors must have been cooking all day. Luis did indeed produce a fiddle. Joined by Josiah on harmonica and one of the railroad men on guitar, they danced under the stars, even Walter taking a turn with Mabel while Eli partnered Mrs. Santos, who'd traveled from town special for the occasion. "You did good," Walter told her as they moved through a simple reel. "Not just the trial, all of it. This place was dying slow before you came. Now look at it." And it was something to see. The new barn solid against the sky, gardens replanted and thriving with careful tending, men laughing and planning for a future that seemed possible again. "It wasn't just me," Mabel protested. "No," Walter agreed. "But you were the spark that lit the fire. Good fire, not the burning kind." As the evening wound down, Eli found her sitting on the porch steps, watching the last dancers. "Happy?" he asked, settling beside her. "Beyond words." She leaned into him, feeling his arm come around her natural as breathing. "6 months ago, I was sure I'd lost everything. Now you're stuck with a bunch of smelly cowboys and a husband who forgets to wipe his boots. And you're stuck with a wife who speaks her mind and can't leave well enough alone. Sounds perfect to me." They sat in comfortable silence, watching clouds chase across the moon. Tomorrow would bring work, always work on a ranch, but also purpose, partnership, and the kind of love that grew stronger with each shared challenge. "I want to expand the school," Mabel said suddenly. "Not just for our hands, but for all the local children. Proper education, not just letters and numbers." "That'll upset some folks. Educating Mexican children, poor children, girls." "Good," she said firmly. "I'm done apologizing for believing people deserve better." He squeezed her shoulder. "Then we'll build a school, right next to the new well we're digging. Education and water, both things folks need to survive out here." Eli called her. "You're going to spoil me with such romantic talk." "Just getting started. Mrs. Calder, we've got a lifetime to make up for a rough beginning." Later, alone in their room now. Not just his. Her things moved from the old kitchen that morning. Mabel unpacked the one item she'd saved through everything, her mother's Bible with the pressed desert marigold. "Nothing blooms without water," she whispered, touching the dried petals. "But some things are strong enough to wait for rain." The rain had come, in its own time and way. Not just water from the sky, but love, community, justice, hope. All the things that made life in this hard land not just bearable but beautiful. Through the window, she could see the windmill turning in the night breeze, repaired and functional again. Come morning, there would be water for the gardens, work for willing hands, lessons for eager minds, and breakfast for hungry cowboys who'd become family. But tonight, there was just peace, and the sound of her husband's breathing as he slept beside her, and the knowledge that some things bought with gold turned out to be beyond price. She tucked the Bible away and blew out the lamp, settling into the darkness that no longer felt like ending but beginning. Outside, a coyote called to its mate across the distance, answered by another voice in harmony. "Good night, Mrs. Calder," Eli murmured, already half asleep. "Good night, Mr. Calder," she whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Good night, good life, good choice made in desperate times that led to this. A love built on respect, tested by fire, and strong enough to last through whatever tomorrow might bring. The desert bloomed when the water came. So did the heart, when it found its home at last. The morning of their second wedding dawned clear and bright, with that peculiar quality of light that only came to the Arizona territory in early autumn. Mabel stood before the mirror in what had been Eli's mother's room, now freshly painted and filled with wildflowers Lucy Santos had brought from town. "Hold still, Señora," Maria Santos commanded, pinning the last of the orange blossoms in Mabel's hair. "There! Beautiful!" The dress was simple, white cotton with tiny blue flowers embroidered at the hem, made by the ladies of Dry Creek as a wedding gift. Nothing like the faded calico she'd worn to that first, desperate ceremony. This time, she was choosing freely. "You ready, girl?" Walter appeared in the doorway, dressed in his cleanest shirt and looking uncharacteristically emotional. "Eli's about to wear a groove in the yard with his pacing." "Ready as I'll ever be," Mabel smiled, taking his offered arm. The transformation of Crown C was remarkable. Garlands of desert flowers hung from every post and beam. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by neighbors far and wide. Luis's fiddle was already singing, joined by guitars and even a piano they'd somehow hauled from town. But Mabel had eyes only for Eli, standing beneath an arch of woven branches and ribbon, his face lighting up when he saw her. He wore a new black suit, but the sun-weathered hands and quiet strength were the same ones that had pulled her from a life of shame. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, the new minister who'd replaced Pike, a young man with kind eyes and dirt under his nails from helping rebuild after the floods. "We gather today to witness something already true, the joining of two hearts that found each other in the wilderness and chose to make it bloom." The ceremony was everything the first hadn't been. When Matthews asked who gave this woman, half the ranch hands stepped forward along with Walter, causing laughter to ripple through the crowd. "We all do," Walter said firmly. "She's our family now." When it came time for vows, Eli had to clear his throat twice before speaking. "Mabel Quinn, you came into my life when I thought I only needed time. Turns out what I needed was you. Your courage, your grace, your stubborn refusal to let this hard land break you. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you through drought and flood, feast and famine, for all the days God grants us." Mabel's own voice was steady, though tears blurred her vision. "Eli Calder, you bought my freedom with gold, but you earned my heart with kindness. You showed me that strength can be gentle, that partnership means more than paper, and that home isn't a place, but the people who choose you. I promise to love you, work beside you, and build with you a life worth living, come what may." "The rings?" Matthews asked. Young Tom limped forward, still favoring his injured ankle, but beaming as he presented the simple gold bands. "With this ring," Eli said, sliding it onto her finger, "I thee wed, again, properly, forever." "With this ring," Mabel repeated, her hands sure as she placed the band on his weathered finger. "I thee wed, by choice, in joy, for always." "Well then," Matthews grinned, "by the power vested in me and the clear evidence of God's blessing on this union, I pronounce you husband and wife in the eyes of all. Eli, kiss your bride like you mean it this time." The cheer that went up when Eli swept her into his arms could probably be heard in Prescott. He kissed her thoroughly, lifting her off her feet while the crowd whooped and hollered. "I love you, Mrs. Calder," he whispered against her lips. "I love you back, Mr. Calder." She laughed. "Now put me down before you scandalize the minister." The celebration that followed was legendary. Cowboys who'd never danced in their lives took turns spinning Mabel around the makeshift floor, Mrs. Harlan and Maria Santos commanded the food tables like generals, making sure everyone ate their fill. Even Hammond and several railroad men attended. Their previous antagonism transformed into respectful business partnership. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains purple and gold. Eli clinked a spoon against his glass for attention. "Friends," he began. "6 months ago, I stood in a very different place. Crown C was failing, drought and debt closing in from all sides. Then I made the best business decision of my life, though I didn't know it at the time." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "But Mabel didn't just save my ranch. She saved all of us, taught us to read and write, to stand up for what's right, to see that community means more than just surviving side by side. She showed us how to thrive." He raised his glass higher. "So here's to my wife, who was sold for gold but rose like the sun over this desert. Here's to all of you, who stood by us when standing wasn't easy. And here's to the future, whatever it brings. We'll face it together." "Together," the crowd echoed, glasses raised. As the party continued around them, Eli drew Mabel aside to a quiet corner of the porch. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the cover embossed with her initials, MQC. "Thought you might want to write it all down," he explained, suddenly shy. "Our story, so folks know how it really was, not the gossip version." "It's perfect," she said, clutching it to her chest. "Though I don't know how to write about this feeling. How do you put into words what it's like to be chosen to choose back?" "Just tell the truth," he said simply. "That's all you've ever done." A commotion near the barn caught their attention. Walter and Luis were unveiling something covered by a large canvas. "Wedding present from all of us," Walter called out, "including some folks who couldn't be here." They pulled away the covering to reveal a new windmill, taller and stronger than the old one, its blades already turning in the evening breeze. "The railroad contributed the materials," Hammond explained. "Your testimony helped us clean out a den of thieves. Least we could do. But this was our doing," Josiah added proudly, gesturing to the base where words had been carved into a wooden plaque, "Calder School, Water and Wisdom for All." "The school," Mabel gasped. "Can't have a school without water." Luis grinned. "We start building next week. Tom and Sam's PA is a carpenter. Says he'll help. By spring, you'll have proper classrooms." Mabel couldn't speak through the tears. Eli's arm came around her, solid and sure. "Thank you," he said for both of them. "All of you." As if the evening couldn't hold more surprises, Doc Morrison stepped forward with an envelope. "This came by special messenger this afternoon, from the territorial governor." Eli opened it, read quickly, then read again more slowly. His expression went from confusion to amazement. "What is it?" Mabel asked. "It's," he cleared his throat, "in recognition of our role in exposing corruption and improving community relations. They're appointing us as official mediators for land and water disputes in the territory. Both of us, equal authority." The crowd erupted again. A woman given equal legal standing to her husband in territorial matters was almost unheard of. "Times are changing," Matthews said approvingly. "About time, too." As the stars came out and the party wound down to intimate groups sharing stories and songs, Mabel found herself by the new windmill with a small gathering of women, Maria Santos, Mrs., Harlan, young Lucy, and several others. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Harlan mused. "A woman sold at auction becoming a territorial official gives a body hope." "Hope is what we make it," Mabel said softly. "Every choice to stand instead of kneel, speak instead of be silent, love instead of fear. That's how the world changes." "Speaking of change," Maria smiled slyly, "when should we expect little Calders running around?" Mabel blushed, her hand moving unconsciously to her still flat stomach. It was too early to be sure, but the signs were there. "When God wills it," she said diplomatically. But Maria's knowing look said she wasn't fooled. Later, much later, when the last guests had departed or found beds in the bunkhouse, Eli and Mabel stood together watching the windmill turn against the star-filled sky. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "How could I regret the path that led me here?" She leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I was sold for gold to pay my father's debt, but I rose because you saw me as more than a transaction. Because the men of this ranch became my brothers. Because neighbors chose justice over convenience. Because love grew in the desert when we gave it water and time." "Poetic," he teased gently. "Maybe you should write that book after all." "Maybe I will. The Passionate Bride of the Cowboy King. How's that for a title?" "Bit dramatic." He laughed. "How about just home?" She turned in his arms, studying his face in the moonlight. "Home," she agreed. "That's really what this story is about. Isn't it finding home in the last place you'd expect, with people you never dreamed would become family?" Inside the house, she showed him where she'd already started writing in the journal. The first words at the top of the page: "No one is ever truly bought or sold. Love is chosen, again and again, in the small acts of courage that make up a life." "The rest will come," she said, "day by day, choice by choice." "Together?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Together," she confirmed, sealing it with a kiss. Through the window, they could see the distant glow of town, where Pike's Church stood empty and Bell's Bank was under new management, where a community was learning to choose justice over greed, mercy over judgment, where their story had already become legend, though the truth was simpler and more complex than any tale. They'd weathered drought and flood, fire and human malice. They'd stood in courtrooms and rebuilt barns, taught letters to cowboys and faced down powerful men. And through it all, they'd discovered that the greatest wealth wasn't in gold or land or water rights, but in the bonds forged by shared struggle and mutual respect. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle lowed contentedly. The new windmill creaked its rhythm, pulling water from deep places to nourish whatever seeds would be planted come spring. "What are you thinking?" Eli asked. Seeing her distant expression, "About that marigold my mother pressed, how she said some things were strong enough to wait for rain." Mabel smiled. She was right. We just had to be patient, strong, and when the water came, we bloomed, he finished. And they had not just survived, but flourished, turning a marriage of desperation into a love story for the ages. In the morning, there would be work. There was always work. But there would also be purpose, laughter, and the quiet joy of building something lasting in a land that tested everything. The brass cufflink that had started their journey toward justice now sat in a jar on the kitchen shelf, transformed from evidence to reminder. Next to it, the old worn gold coin that had represented her sale, now just another piece of metal with no power over their future. As they prepared for bed in their shared room, Mabel caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the ashamed girl who'd stood on an auction platform. This woman stood straight, met her own eyes without flinching, wore her happiness like a crown. "You're beautiful," Eli said, coming up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm happy," she corrected, then reconsidered. Maybe that's the same thing. Outside, the windmill turned eternal, and the stars wheeled overhead. And Crown Sea Ranch settled into peaceful sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight there was only gratitude for the winding path that had led them here. Love wasn't just chosen once, in a desperate moment or a joyful ceremony. It was chosen every day, in every small act of care and courage. And here, in this place they'd built with blood and sweat and dreams, they would keep choosing it, again and again, for all the days to come. The desert had taught them patience. The drought had taught them strength. The floods and fires had taught them resilience. But most of all, they'd taught each other that home wasn't a place, but a promise. To stand together, build together, and never stop believing that even the driest ground could bloom when tended with faithful hands. And somewhere in the quiet house, a new life quickened, the next chapter already beginning, carried like seeds on the desert wind toward whatever morning would bring. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope the journey of Mabel and Eli touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Please comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with fellow lovers of Western romance. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night for more tales of love, courage, and redemption in the American frontier. Don't forget to like this video and hit that hype button to help more people discover these passionate stories of the Old West. Until next time, partners.